It wasn't a subtle thing, not a small, private sound she tried to stifle behind a polite hand. No, it was a sharp, barking laugh, a sound like shattering glass that just eviscerated the thick, anxious silence of the courtroom. The sound was ugly, devoid of humor, and it echoed off the wood-paneled walls, a pure expression of contempt. She actually, truly laughed at my daughter. In that instant, I felt my blood turn to ice, a sudden, horrifying chill that had nothing to do with the freezing air conditioning blasting from the ceiling vents. My lawyer, David, was still talking. His voice a low, earnest drone laying out the foundations of our case, but I couldn't hear a single word he was saying. His voice became a distant hum, like traffic on a faraway highway. All I could see, burned into my vision, was the smug, dismissive curl of Ms. Karen Whitmore's lip, the condescending tilt of her head. All I could feel was the violent tremor that shot through my 10-year-old daughter's hand, which I was squeezing so hard my own knuckles had turned a bloodless white. I forced myself to look at Lila, my beautiful, brilliant, fiercely spirited girl, whose soul was as vibrant as a supernova but as fragile as spun glass. I had made a silent, sacred promise to her the day we met, a promise that I would be her shield, that I would protect her from a world that had already tried its very best to break her spirit. And right here, in this supposed hall of justice, under the sterile, humming fluorescent lights that flickered erratically, I was failing. Utterly and completely failing. I was certain we'd lost. The immense, crushing weight of the state, of a soulless bureaucracy, of pure, unadulterated prejudice, was a physical thing pressing down on my chest, squeezing the very air from my lungs. I felt like I was drowning. But just as a single tear I'd been fighting with every ounce of my will finally broke free, tracing a hot, traitorous path down my cheek, a loud, explosive crack echoed through the room, startling everyone. It was the unmistakable sound of solid wood hitting solid wood. The judge, a man whose face had been a stone mask of impartiality for the past 2 grueling hours, had slammed his gavel down with shocking force. The room went dead silent. The air grew thick and heavy. Even the persistent tick-tock of the large clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. He glared. His eyes narrowed into slits of cold, concentrated fury, aimed directly at the social worker. The force of his gaze was palpable. Ms. Whitmore physically recoiled, her smug expression finally faltering. Then his gaze shifted, moving deliberately past her, past the lawyers at their tables, and it landed squarely on me. In a heartbeat, his entire expression changed. The raw anger melted away, replaced by something I couldn't possibly read. A deep, profound shock that rippled across his features, a look so unexpected that no one, least of all me, could have ever predicted it. "What are you doing here?" he asked. His voice wasn't the authoritative boom I had expected. It was a whisper, a raw, incredulous whisper that seemed to suck all the other sound out of the room, a whisper that carried the impossible weight of a ghost from a long-forgotten past. He wasn't talking to the social worker. He wasn't talking to my lawyer. He was talking to me. And to understand why that single mystifying question would unravel everything, not just a complicated and painful court case, but the very fabric of our lives, we have to go back. Back before the cold courtroom, before the insidious whispers and vile accusations, back to a simpler time, when our life was just ours. Our story, Lila's and mine, started not with a dramatic bang, but with a quiet, persistent, aching emptiness. My husband, Tom, and I had carved out a comfortable, happy life in a sleepy Ohio suburb where the biggest news was the annual bake sale. We had good jobs, a circle of great friends, and a deep, abiding love for each other that was the unshakable foundation of our world. But our third bedroom, the one we had painted a hopeful shade of sunny yellow, stayed stubbornly, painfully empty. After years of emotional roller coasters, of hope followed by crushing heartbreak, of sterile doctor's appointments that felt more like funerals, we had to confront the devastating reality that our path to becoming parents was going to look different than we had imagined. It was a grief we had to work through together, a silent sorrow that lingered in the quiet moments, and out of that shared grief, a new kind of hope slowly, tentatively, began to grow: adoption. We weren't trying to save a child or be heroes. We just desperately wanted to build a family, to fill that quiet third bedroom with laughter and life. The process was an absolute mountain of paperwork, an Everest of forms that threatened to consume our dining room table. It was a marathon of deeply personal interviews and home studies that felt like a psychological excavation. We were poked, prodded, and picked apart, our entire lives laid bare for strangers to judge. Then, after almost 2 impossibly long years, we got the call that changed everything. Her name was Lila. She was 7 years old, and her file read like a miniature tragedy, a collection of cold, bureaucratic words that failed to capture the spirit of the child they described. She'd been lost in the foster system for 4 long years, bouncing between 3 different homes after her birth mother had supposedly died in a car accident. The file used detached, clinical terms like withdrawn, and warned that she had behavioral challenges. The first time I saw her, she was sitting on a small, bright blue plastic chair in a sterile agency playroom, a room that smelled of disinfectant and forced cheerfulness. She was clutching a worn-out, dog-eared sketchbook to her chest as if it were a shield. Her dark curls were a beautiful, chaotic halo around a face dominated by these enormous, soulful brown eyes. And in those eyes I saw a profound caution, a deep-seated weariness that no 7-year-old should ever have to carry. I approached her slowly, carefully, as one might approach a frightened deer. I knelt, not too close, giving her space, and just said softly, "Hi, Lila. My name is Elena. I love your sketchbook." She didn't answer, not with words. But her eyes, those incredibly perceptive eyes, never left mine. She didn't pull away. She just watched me, her gaze steady and almost unervingly intelligent. Felt like she was looking right through me, peering into my very soul. In that long, silent moment of her sizing me up, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with her. I knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in my bones, that she was my daughter. The first few months were a delicate, intricate dance of advancing and retreating. Lila was like a little ghost in our house, a silent, watchful observer. She spoke in whispers so soft you had to lean in to hear them, and spent countless hours in her room, her sketchbook her only confidant. Tom and I instinctively knew that the worst thing we could do was push. So we just gave her space and time. We were just there. A constant, steady, unobtrusive presence. There for breakfast every single morning, with a bowl of her favorite cereal waiting. There to quietly tuck her in at night, even if she just stared at the ceiling, lost in her own world. We filled the house with a quiet, patient, steady love, hoping it would eventually seep through the cracks in the formidable armor she had built around herself. And slowly, miraculously, it did. It started with a tiny, hesitant question, whispered from the doorway of the kitchen, about what was for dinner. Then one afternoon, she shyly approached me and opened her sketchbook, not to a page of shadows, but to a wobbly, incredibly colorful picture of the 3 of us. We were holding hands under a giant, smiling sun. My heart felt like it would burst. The first time she laughed, a real, full-throated, joyous laugh at one of Tom's terribly constructed dad jokes, was the single most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. It was like the first day of spring after a long, hard winter. If our story resonates with you, if you believe in fighting for family, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more stories like this. Over the next 3 years, Lila blossomed. The withdrawn, silent girl was gone, replaced by a vibrant, whip-smart, and deeply funny 10-year-old with a sarcastic sense of humor that kept Tom and me constantly on our toes. Our house wasn't quiet anymore. It was gloriously, wonderfully loud. It was filled with her music lessons, her excited chatter about the fantasy books she was devouring, her hilariously serious arguments with Tom over the official rules of Monopoly. We were a family, messy, imperfect, chaotic, and so deeply happy. Our little bubble of peace felt like an impenetrable fortress. We thought we had finally built it strong enough to withstand anything the world could throw at us. We were profoundly wrong. The first sign of the coming storm arrived with a scream in the dead of night. It wasn't a child's bad dream whimper. It was a raw, primal, terrified sound that ripped me from a deep sleep. My heart instantly hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. Tom was already out of bed, his face a mask of alarm in the dim moonlight filtering through our window. We met in the hallway, our eyes wide with a shared panic. The screams were coming from Lila's room. We burst in to find her bolted upright in bed, her pajamas drenched in sweat, her eyes wide with a terror that wasn't focused on us, but on something unseen in the room. "No," she sobbed, her small body shaking uncontrollably as she stared at the far corner of her room. "Don't take her. The shadows. The shadows took her." I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her trembling body into mine, trying to anchor her in reality. "It's okay, sweetie, you're safe," I whispered, rocking her gently. "It was just a nightmare. Mommy and Daddy are here. You're safe." It took almost an hour of soft reassurances and gentle humming to calm her down. She finally fell into a fitful, exhausted sleep, her hand clutching my shirt in a death grip. I sat there in the dark, watching the troubled rise and fall of her chest, a cold, hard knot of dread tightening in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't her first nightmare since coming to us, but it was by far the worst, the most visceral and terrifying. They started happening all the time after that, almost every night. The details, when she could articulate them through her tears, were always terrifyingly consistent. Dark, formless shadows that had no faces but felt malevolent, a suffocating feeling of being watched, and a desperate, agonizing cry for a sister who was being stolen away from her. During the day, the vibrant Lila we knew began to recede. She grew quiet again, the light in her eyes dimming. Her sketchbook, once filled with smiling suns and colorful family portraits, was now filled with dark, swirling masses of black and gray, and tiny, terrified figures cowering in corners. Then her teacher called, her voice laced with professional concern. Lila was falling asleep in class, and the bubbly girl who loved to participate had become quiet and distant again. The teacher mentioned the disturbing dark drawings and then, hesitantly, said that, following school protocol, she had to file a report with Child Services. "It's just a formality, Elena," she promised, trying to sound reassuring. "I'm sure they'll just check in, see how wonderful your home is, and close the case immediately." That's how Ms. Karen Whitmore walked into our lives. Her voice on the phone was as brisk and cold as a winter wind. She arrived on a rainy Tuesday, and I can still hear the sharp, judgmental click-clack of her heels on our hardwood floors, a sound that, in my memory, sounds like a countdown. She was a woman in her 40s with a severe, angular haircut and a face that seemed permanently stuck in a look of faint disapproval. She held a clipboard to her chest like it was both a shield and a weapon. "So," she began, not waiting for an invitation as she pulled out a chair at our kitchen table. "This is the child in question." She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at Lila, not like a person, but like a biologist studying an interesting but slightly distasteful bug under a microscope. "Lila, your teacher tells me you've been having some very bad dreams." Lila shrank in her chair, trying to make herself smaller. I gave her a small, encouraging nod. "Sometimes," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain outside. "Tell me about them, sweetie," Ms. Whitmore said, her tone a sickly sweet, condescending coo that made the hair on my arms stand up. Lila hesitated, glancing at me for reassurance. "The shadows, they come at night," she began, her voice trembling. "They say I'm not supposed to be happy. They say they're going to take me away like they took my sister." Ms. Whitmore leaned forward, her face a mask of what she clearly thought was deep concern. She listened, nodding slowly. And then she did it. She chuckled. It was a short, dismissive little bark of a sound. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dripping with a foul, synthetic pity. "That's just your imagination running wild. It's very, very common. Adopted kids, especially those in transracial placements, often invent these elaborate stories to get attention. It's a textbook way of processing feelings of abandonment. You should know you're a very lucky little girl to have this nice white family pretending to care so much about you." The air went out of my lungs as if I'd been punched. "Pretending." I choked out, the word catching in my throat. Lila's face just crumpled. It was a devastating sight. The bright, resilient confidence she had spent 3 painstaking years building vanished in a single, cruel instant. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. "But it feels real," she whispered, her voice breaking. I feel it. Ms. Whitmore waved a dismissive hand, already scribbling furiously on her clipboard. Feelings aren't facts, child. You're projecting. It's a classic symptom of unresolved trauma, which you are now misdirecting at your current caregivers. That's when I snapped. A pure, white-hot rage, unlike anything I had ever felt, washed over me, burning away my fear and shock. How dare you? I snarled, my voice low and shaking with fury. How dare you sit in my home at my kitchen table and laugh at my daughter's pain? Get out. Get out of my house. Now. She didn't even flinch. She just rose slowly from her chair with a small, cruel, triumphant smirk. Hostility and emotional instability noted in the home, she said, her voice cold and clinical as she made another precise note on her form. The mother is clearly unable to handle the child's complex psychological needs. I'll be recommending a full evaluation for the family, and perhaps a temporary placement in a more suitable environment. She clicked her pen with a sickening finality, snapped her clipboard shut, and walked out, leaving our happy world in smoldering ruins. The next few days were a living nightmare. I held Lila as she sobbed for hours, her small body racked with pain, her words like knives in my heart. She thinks I'm lying, Mommy. She thinks you're just pretending to love me. Guilt, thick and suffocating, clawed at my throat. Was I naive? Had I been so caught up in our happiness that I'd ignored something crucial? Was I just another white savior, as she had implied, incapable of understanding my daughter's true needs? The laughter in our house died completely, replaced by a thick, anxious silence that felt heavier than stone. Tom was terrified, his face etched with worry. Elena, this woman has power, he warned, his voice strained. She can take Lila from us. We have to be smart. We have to play her game. But I couldn't. I couldn't play a game where my daughter's soul was the prize. That one dismissive, ugly laugh had lit a fire in me, a mother's righteous fury, and it burned away all my fear. Driven by a desperate, frantic energy, I went to the attic and pulled down the heavy, dusty box of Lila's adoption paperwork. I sat on the dusty floorboards for hours, the air thick with the smell of old paper, going through every single piece of paper, every form, every report. And that's when I found it. Tucked away inside a plain manila envelope I'd never noticed before was a faded, slightly creased photograph. It was a picture of a young woman holding a baby. The baby was unmistakably Lila. I could see it in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile. But the woman, she looked nothing like the grainy, grim driver's license photo of the birth mother in the official file. This woman was beautiful, with warm, kind eyes and the same rich, lovely skin as my daughter. And her eyes. They were Lila's eyes. You could feel the overwhelming love pouring out of that photograph. Who was she? Why was this hidden? I immediately called the adoption agency, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread, but I hit a cold, bureaucratic brick wall. Records are sealed for a reason, Mrs. Harper, the caseworker said flatly, her voice devoid of any empathy. Continuing to contest the official record could be seen as detrimental to the child's stability. It was a veiled threat, and I heard it loud and clear. Meanwhile, Ms. Whitmore launched her official attack. Her report was a masterwork of malicious fiction, painting me as an unstable, hostile mother and Lila as a deeply disturbed child on the verge of a breakdown. She used loaded, biased phrases like cultural mismatch and fostering delusional ideation in the child. She recommended mandatory therapy for Lila, with a therapist of her choosing, of course, and intensive parenting classes for us. It was a clear, calculated strategy to build a paper trail, a case to take her away. Unscheduled wellness checks became her new favorite weapon. She'd show up at dinner time on a Saturday morning while we were trying to have a peaceful breakfast, her clipboard ready, a false smile plastered on her face. She would pull Lila aside for private chats that left my daughter pale, trembling, and more withdrawn than ever. The shadows from her nightmares had taken up permanent residence in her eyes. I knew I couldn't fight this systemic monster alone. A friend of a friend, horrified by our story, put me in touch with David Chen, a brilliant, passionate young pro bono lawyer who specialized in fighting child services overreach. "This is a targeted, prejudiced attack," he said during our first meeting, his eyes flashing with a controlled anger as he reviewed Whitmore's report. "Her bias is all over this. We can fight it. We will fight it." It's truly heartbreaking how a system meant to protect children can be twisted and used to harm them. If you've ever felt like you were up against an impossible system, let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. And please share this video with your friends so more people can be aware of these issues. David was a whirlwind of focused energy. His first big, aggressive move was to subpoena all of Ms. Whitmore's internal emails and case notes related to Lila. The agency fought it tooth and nail, claiming confidentiality, but David, citing procedural bias, won the motion. 2 days later, I was in his cluttered, book-filled office, staring at a literal mountain of printouts. We read for hours, fueled by stale coffee and a desperate hope. Then we found it. An email from Karen Whitmore to her direct supervisor. "The Harper case, Lila M., is proving more difficult than anticipated," she wrote. "The mother is resistant. However, I am confident that with continued and sustained pressure, we can establish sufficient grounds for removal within the next 6 to 8 weeks. This would free up significant foster funds for our more critical high-need cases and, more importantly, open a high-value placement spot." I stared at the words, reading them over and over. Free up foster funds. High-value placement spot. They were talking about my daughter, my living, breathing, laughing, crying child. As if she were a line item on a budget. A commodity to be traded. The malice wasn't just Whitmore's personal prejudice. It was how she expertly twisted the cold, transactional language of the very system she served into a weapon. "This is it," David said, his voice grim, but with an undercurrent of triumph. "This is the weapon we need to expose her." And so, we found ourselves in that cold, intimidating courtroom, in front of Judge Harlan Graves. He was an older man with a face etched with the deep lines of 1,000 difficult decisions, a man who radiated an aura of weary authority. Karen Whitmore was called to the stand first. Her testimony was a masterclass in professional condescension and manipulative jargon. "In my expert opinion," she said smoothly, addressing the judge as if they were old colleagues, "the child, Lila, is exhibiting classic signs of attachment disorder, compounded by severe identity confusion stemming from the transracial adoption. These elaborate fantasies of shadows and a lost sister are not memories. They are complex psychological constructs. A clear and desperate cry for help." She skillfully portrayed our loving home as a pressure cooker of instability and maternal anxiety. "Mrs. Harper's aggressive resistance to recommended therapy," she concluded with a sad, theatrical shake of her head, "is, unfortunately, exacerbating the child's delusional behaviors and hindering any potential for recovery." Then it was Lila's turn. My heart shattered into a million pieces as she walked to the stand, a tiny, fragile figure swallowed by the enormous witness chair. David asked her gently, his voice soft and kind, to tell the judge about her dreams. "They're about the shadows," she whispered, her small knuckles turning white as she gripped the arms of the chair. "They're dark, and they don't have faces. They come into my room. They took my sister. I tried to stop them, but I couldn't." Tears began to stream down her face, a silent testament to her terror. And that's when it happened. That's when Karen Whitmore laughed. That sharp, cruel barking sound. "See?" she stage whispered to the county lawyer, but it was loud enough for half the room to hear. "Delusional. Textbook." Judge Graves' head snapped up. The look he gave her could have frozen fire. He made a small, angry, deliberate note on his legal pad. His jaw clenched tight. Finally, it was my turn. My entire body was trembling, but when I spoke, my voice was steel. I told them about the scared, silent ghost of a girl I first met and the bright, funny, wonderful daughter she had become in our care. "Lila is not delusional," I said, my voice clear and ringing with conviction. "She is traumatized. She is a child grappling with a loss so profound and terrifying she can only express it in nightmares." Ms. Whitmore never saw my daughter. She saw a file. She saw a problem. She saw a budget line. Then, David handed me the faded photograph from the attic. Yes, I said, holding it up for the judge to see. This was tucked inside Lila's official file. It's her as a baby, with a woman I do not recognize. The woman in this photograph is not the woman listed in the file as her birth mother. David presented the photograph as evidence. Then he dropped the first bombshell, the email. The courtroom was utterly silent as Judge Graves read the printout. His stern expression hardened into something much colder. His jaw tightened visibly. Ms. Whitmore's professional composure finally cracked. A dark red flush crept up her neck as she stared intently at the floor, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. But David wasn't done. He called his expert witness, a renowned child therapist who specialized in early childhood trauma. She testified with calm authority that Lila's drawings and nightmares were not signs of delusion. In cases of profound pre-verbal childhood trauma, she explained, the brain doesn't store perfect linear memories. It stores sensory data, feelings, powerful images, and fragments. The shadows Lila describes are a classic symbolic representation for a terrifying, unknown, and faceless threat. The recurring theme of a lost sister points directly to a real, traumatic separation event that her conscious mind has suppressed but her subconscious is struggling desperately to voice. A sister. A real separation. My mind flashed to the dense adoption file, to a line item I had barely registered. Sibling separation status. Confirmed. It was real. Just as the county lawyer, now looking flustered, stood up to object, David held up a hand. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but new evidence has just this moment become available. He walked to the bench holding a large, sealed manila envelope. I believe this will be dispositive for the case. The judge took the envelope, his expression curious. He broke the seal and pulled out a thick stack of papers. As he began to read the first page, his face went completely white. He let out a small, audible gasp. His eyes widened in sheer disbelief. He looked up, his shocked gaze flying past a confused Whitmore and locking directly onto me. He frantically leafed through the pages, his expression shifting from pure shock to horror to a dawning, terrible, world-altering understanding. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. The official story, he began, his voice low and grave, is that Lila's birth mother, a Jane Doe, died in a car accident 7 years ago. That story is a complete and utter lie. Gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom. According to this newly unsealed police file, the judge continued, his voice growing colder and harder with every word, the woman's real name was Amelia Coleman, and she didn't die in an accident. She was murdered. A woman in the gallery let out a small cry. Amelia Coleman, the judge continued, his voice now shaking with rage, was a bookkeeper at the County Child Services Agency. She was a whistleblower. She was gathering evidence on a ring of corrupt officials within the agency who were manipulating foster placements and adoptions for financial kickbacks. They were falsifying records, illegally separating siblings, and in some cases, trafficking children through their network. He looked directly at a stunned and paling Karen Whitmore. Her direct supervisor, a Mr. Gerald Finney. He pointed a trembling finger to Whitmore's boss, who was sitting in the back of the court and was now attempting to discreetly stand up, was the ringleader. The shadows that Lila remembers so vividly were likely Mr. Finney and his associates, coming to Amelia's home to murder her and stage it as a car accident. They then put her 2 young children into the very system they controlled, separating them immediately to cover their tracks and silence the witness. The judge slammed the file down on his bench. Furthermore, DNA evidence contained in this file confirms that the woman in the photograph I was shown earlier is Amelia's sister, who had been raising both Lila and her infant sister after Amelia's death. The agency, under completely false pretenses orchestrated by Mr. Finney, seized both children from her custody. The baby sister has never been found. He looked at the bailiffs, his face a mask of cold fury. "Take Ms. Whitmore and Mr. Finney into custody." Immediately, chaos erupted. Whitmore started to shriek denials and accusations. But I barely heard it. My world had tilted on its axis. Lila had a sister. A real sister. Her mother, the woman who adopted her first, was a murdered hero. My head was spinning, trying to process the sheer horror of it all. This story took a turn none of us could have seen coming, and it just goes to show how fighting for the truth can uncover things you never imagined. If you believe in the power of truth, please hit that subscribe button. We're building a community here, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. But the final, most impossible twist was yet to come. As a sobbing Whitmore was led away in handcuffs, Judge Graves slammed his gavel again, demanding order. He looked at me, his face a complex mixture of awe, sorrow, and something else I couldn't name. "Mrs. Harper," he said gently, his voice softer now. "May I ask you your maiden name?" Confused, I answered, my voice a hoarse whisper. "It's Rossi. Elena Rossi." A single tear escaped and rolled down the judge's weathered cheek. "I thought so," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "During the recess, I acted on a hunch, a ghost of a memory from a case 20 years ago. It's not standard procedure, but I ran your name through a separate, sealed international database for missing persons." He took a deep, shaky breath, his eyes fixed on mine. 11 years ago, you were a college student studying abroad in Italy, correct? In a small town in the south. I could only nod, my heart starting to pound in my chest. A memory I had buried under a mountain of grief. A pain so immense I had locked it away, threatened to surface. "You suffered a sudden medical emergency," the judge continued, his voice gentle but clear. "You were rushed to a local hospital. You were told you had a late-term miscarriage, that the baby girl didn't survive." "Yes," I whispered, the word a ghost on my lips, the old agony fresh as a new wound. The judge looked at me, his eyes filled with an almost unbearable pity and wonder. "Elena, there was no miscarriage. You gave birth to a healthy baby girl. The hospital was part of an international child trafficking ring. They faked the death certificate and sold your daughter to an American adoption broker. That broker worked directly with Gerald Finney's corrupt network here in Ohio." He picked up one last single piece of paper from the file. "According to the DNA profile in this file, Amelia Coleman was not Lila's biological mother. She was her adoptive mother. She had adopted a baby girl who had come through Finney's illegal network a year prior to her death. A baby girl whose origins were a complete fabrication, whose records were forged from scratch." He looked from the paper to me and then to Lila, who was standing beside David, staring at the judge, her eyes wider than I had ever seen them, her face a canvas of dawning comprehension. "Lila is not your adopted daughter, Elena," the judge said, his voice breaking with the sheer weight of his words. "My God, she's your biological daughter. The daughter you thought you lost 11 years ago." The air left my body in a single, gut-wrenching sob. It was a sound of absolute shock, of uncontainable joy, of a horror so immense it had somehow, impossibly, become a miracle. It all made sense. The instant magnetic connection I felt in that playroom. The bone-deep feeling that she was mine. She was mine. Lila looked at me, her face a storm of confusion, shock, and wondrous recognition. Then she broke away from David and she ran. She ran to me, flinging her arms around my neck and burying her face in my chest. "Mommy," she sobbed, but the word was different now. It was a discovery. It was a homecoming. "You're my real mommy." I wrapped my arms around her, holding on to my daughter, my long-lost child, my brave, beautiful, miraculous girl. The world, the judge, the chaos of the courtroom, the flashing lights of cameras that were suddenly there. All of it just faded away into an insignificant blur. The only thing that was real was the small, warm body clinging to me, the feeling of her familiar curls against my cheek, and the unbreakable, undeniable truth of our blood. I had walked into that courtroom prepared to fight to the death to save my adopted daughter, but in the end she had saved me. She had unknowingly led me back to a part of myself I thought was buried forever in Italian soil, and made our family whole in a way I could never, in my wildest dreams, have imagined.